Hello and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. Today is Thursday, October the 10th, and the planet Jupiter just recently stationed retrograde in Gemini. This was a couple days ago, and the ruler of Gemini is Mercury. Mercury is in Libra. Mercury has just completed a trine to Jupiter in Gemini, and is now separating from that trine and approaching a square with Pluto in Capricorn. Now, I was thinking about, in making this video, whether to talk about both the Mercury dynamics with all these aspects Mercury has been making, or just focus on Jupiter retrograde. But since Mercury is the ruler of Gemini, you can understand that these two things are related and also in aspect to each other. And one of the things to consider about all this is that Mercury, my last video was about Mercury making a square to Mars in Cancer and feeling certain blocks or obstacles around communication and stuff like that. And now Mercury is making this square to Pluto, and Pluto usually has to do all with sorts of things like hidden power dynamics and stuff like that. And well, I mean, one of the things that I've just been feeling recently with a lot of stuff, and then like we have in the news all this stuff about war, all this stuff about natural disasters, and I've been feeling kind of insignificant, of whatever it is that I've got going on in my life, of whatever I've got to say, or any of my own, requests that anybody pay attention to me, and whatever I could contribute to this big mess that we are in as a human civilization, right? And obviously, there is, as a person who has an astrology channel, as a person who's interested in divination, things like this, there's a whole opportunity, obviously, for making predictions for what's going, especially with the elections that are coming up, especially for this threat of looming. I mean, there already is war, so it's not really like there's a threat of looming war. We're already in the midst of war. But, I made a video a while back why I didn't think we were going to have a big World War III, at least not at this particular point in time. We just seem to have a tendency to be stuck in a state of perpetual war that flares up quite a bit, right? And there's something about all this, about the role of somebody who has an astrology channel, somebody who is making divinations for my own life, and just for some reason, I have decided that rather than trying to make some videos about, like, who do I predict is going to win this election? What do I predict is going to happen with this war or although these kinds of, like, big things that are affecting so many people, that instead, today anyways, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to talk to you about a couple science fiction novels I've been reading. And I have to admit that I read science fiction novels because I like science fiction. This could be partly due to the influence of my dad, who passed away, who was a big influence on me in terms of my dad was a huge science fiction guy, and introduced me to all these, like, science fiction classics as a kid, and just kind of got me primed for being into sci-fi, right? And you may also notice I have a Philip K. Dick poster on my wall, and I have to admit that Philip K. Dick is not he's got this kind of funny reputation in that, in a way, he's like one of the best and one of the worst science fiction writers. He has a certain style, or I think he even said that he had, he may have written a number of classic books, but he can't really tell which ones those are, and that the good stuff he writes is so mixed up with bad stuff that he writes that he's not really sure if he can really judge what is good and what is not good. And I have Philip K. Dick up on my wall because at a certain time in my life when I was dealing with mental health challenges, Philip K. Dick was something to reach for anyways, to give me some kind of sense of guidance of the territory that I was in. Not even to say that my experience matched his entirely, but at least there was some other way of looking at things. And there's also another, Philip K. Dick also opened me up to looking at like Christianity or religion in a much more open way than what the people in my life tend to look at things a lot more narrowly. And then dealing with Philip K. Dick would just open things up a lot for me, right? And that being said, one of Philip K. Dick's friends was Ursula K. Le Guin, and Ursula K. Le Guin did not approve of Philip K. Dick's. I really love Philip K. Dick's Valis. Ursula K. Le Guin thought Philip K. Dick was off his rocker, and he was basically, it was a promising sci-fi writer who just lost the plot and was just putting out garbage, basically, right? And so this has, for a while, put me off of reading Ursula K. Le Guin. I did pick up her book on the Tao Te Ching, but I never had read any Ursula K. Le Guin's science fiction stories, and I just, for whatever reason, I was motivated to start reading Ursula K. Le Guin. I didn't even know where to start, so I was asking around on the Weird Studies Discord for recommendations for which Ursula K. Le Guin, where to start reading Ursula K. Le Guin, and I was thinking about reading The Wizard of Earthsea, but instead I was recommended, this is apparently her breakout hit, The Left Hand of Darkness. And so I've started reading this, and the things I've had this sort of like attitude to, not just use whatever material comes up in my whatever I'm reading for astrology, or not even to like use astrology to figure out who I should read or something, but I'm starting to read this, I should say, after finishing another book, which is quite a big one. This one called Dhalgren by Samuel R. Delany. And it's an 800-page book. I was reading this for a good chunk of this year. And they're both similar in the sense that apparently, I think Le Guin published this in 1969. This first came out in 1969. And then Delany started writing this in 1960. He wrote this from like 1969 to like 1973 or something like that. So they're both like science fiction book novels of the peak of the 1960s, right? And I'm just reading this mainly because, okay, I got into Dhalgren from Weird Studies, specifically the Weird Studies episode on Stalker, and there's something about Stalker that is like going into a zone, right? And Dhalgren was introduced as a classic zone book but I'm not going to get too much into Dhalgren yet. I think I'm going to start with the Ursula K. Le Guin. But there's some kind of like common thread between both of these books, and this kind of 1960s sci-fi, and doing with a couple of things of doing with like either gender fluidity, to do with changing social norms, those kinds of things, right? But one of the things that I find particularly interesting, why am I doing this video right now, is because I didn't look into the astrology charts of Ursula K. Le Guin or Samuel R. Delany until just recently, and I noticed that both of them have Jupiter in Gemini. And as I'm sitting around being like, oh man, there's all these, all the wars and natural disasters, and I feel, I don't feel like it's right for me to like try to exploit that to make my astrology channel so, like try to be sensationalistic, like who's going to win the election? Is there going to be a war? Do all these kinds of things, right? And then I find out that these books that I'm reading are a bunch of Jupiter and Gemini people right as Jupiter is in Gemini, is stationing retrograde in Gemini. Not only that, but if you look at Ursula K. Le Guin's chart, I have my Ursula K. Le Guin has Moon conjunct Jupiter in Gemini with the Sun at 28 degrees Libra, making it's a loose trine, but then she's also got Venus at 2 degrees Libra, Mercury at 10 degrees Libra, Mercury in Libra making a trine to Jupiter in Gemini, very similar to what we just had as a transit, right? And so I just saw this and I'm like, it's kind of like, it's too good, right? This is too perfect. And then in comparison, Delany has Mars conjunct Jupiter in Gemini, a bit of a different dynamic, with Moon in Libra, trining that, and Sun in Aries. So a full moon, Sun in Aries, Moon in Libra, and this, that kind of goes with this recent Aries Libra eclipse cycle that we just finished off. So, and I didn't even look at these astrology charts. This is just what I was drawn to myself, and it just so happens that it goes well with these. I can kind of focus on the. This is a kind of a Jupiter and Gemini thing, and specifically what I'm talking about with, like, there's a certain kind of, like, either gender fluidity or a kind of, like, I don't know if you could call it multiculturalism, but both coming across in very different ways across both of these books, right? And again, I'm only started reading this one. I don't want to embarrass myself by pointing out how slow. I don't know. I read at my own pace. I don't have to justify it, but I'm gonna read. There's something about this, without getting overly into the plot of The Left Hand of Darkness, I'm going to read a little bit that has to do with fortune telling or with divination. And I'm just going to read a little tiny bit because I feel a little bit funny because I haven't, I feel like I should read the whole book before just giving you a little chunk of it. But there's something that I feel resonates with some of what I feel with this project that I'm doing, where I'm continuing doing an astrology channel, but I'm obviously, I'm deciding to read science fiction books rather than address some of these current events, right? So this is I'm going to skip around a little bit here. I've come with a question for the foretellers. Then perhaps you'll want to speak to the weaver. He's down in the glade now, unless he went out with the wood sledge. Or would you rather talk first to one of the celibates? I'm not sure. I'm exceedingly ignorant. The young man laughed and bowed. I am honored, he said. I've lived here 3 years, but I haven't yet acquired enough ignorance to be worth mentioning. He was highly amused, but his manner was gentle, and I managed to recollect enough scraps of Handara lore to realize that I had been boasting, very much as if I'd come up to him and said, I'm exceedingly handsome. I meant I don't know anything about the foretellers. Enviable, said the young indweller. Behold, we must sully the plain snow with footprints in order to get anywhere. May I show you the way to the glade? My name is Goss. So this is, like I said, I have Ursula K. Le Guin's version of the Tao Te Ching, and there's a certain kind of, like, Taoist sense of humor showing through here in that, it's the same thing about, like, you don't want to brag about saying how humble you are. And in this culture, you don't want to put on, like, ignorance in this sense of, like, not like ignorance is bliss, but kind of this kind of Zen quality of knowing that you don't know, or knowing when it's better not to say something, or knowing or balancing a kind of insight with the kind of sense of like knowing when not to ask questions. And there's this kind of thing that it's like there's this idea that, you know, like in spite of all the problems that we're facing in the world, that there's some kind of inherent perfection to all of it. But then if you want to like make an astrology channel and start talking about this mess that we're in and start making, it's like you are sullying the perfect snow by putting your footprints all over it, right? I'm going to skip around a little bit more here. After a moment, he smiled and said in a soft, rather high voice, "You're the envoy, aren't you?" I stammered and said, "Yes. My name is Faxt. We're honored to receive you. Will you stay with us in other horde a while?" "Willingly. I am seeking to learn about your practice of foretelling, and if there's anything I can tell you in return about what I am, where I come from, whatever you like," said Faxt with a serene smile. "This is a pleasant thing, and that you should cross the ocean of space and add another 1,000 miles and a crossing of the Karga to your journey to come to us here. I wanted to come to Other Horde because of the fame of its predictions. You want to watch us foretelling then, perhaps, or have you a question of your own?" His clear and eyes compelled truth. "I don't know," I said. "Nesooth," said he, "it doesn't matter. Perhaps if you stay a while you'll find you have a question or no question. There are only certain times, you know, when the foretellers are able to meet together, so in any case you dwell with us for some days." I'm just skipping around. It was an introverted life, a self-sufficient, stagnant, steeped with that singular ignorance prized by the Handarata and obedient to their rule of inactivity and non-interference. That rule expressed in the word Nesuth, which I have to translate as no matter, is the heart of the cult, and I don't pretend to understand it. But I began to understand Karhide better after a half month on the Other Horde. Under that nation's politics and parades and passions runs an old darkness, passive, anarchic, silent, the fecund darkness of the Handara. Young Goss, who enjoyed acting as my guide, told me that my questions to the foretellers could concern anything and be phrased as I liked. The more qualified and limited the question, the more exact the answer, he said. Vagueness breeds vagueness, and some questions, of course, are not answerable. "Then what if I ask one of those?" I inquired. This hedging seemed sophisticated but not unfamiliar, but I did not expect his answer. "The Weaver will refuse it. Unanswerable questions have wrecked foretelling groups." "Wrecked them? Do you know the story of Lord Shorth, who forced the foretellers of Asin Fastness to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Well, it was a couple thousand years ago. The foretellers stayed in the darkness for 6 days and nights. At the end, all the celibates were catatonic, the zanies were dead, the pervert clubbed the Lord of Shorth to death with a stone, and the Weaver? Well, he was a man named Mesh." "You mean the founder of the Yomesh cult?" "Yes," said Goss, and laughed as if the story was very funny, but I didn't know whether the joke was on the Yoshimesta or me. And there's another whole question here, is a parable about somebody who's very fixed on answering questions and wanting a very linear answer to them, and the only answers this guy gets in this parable are riddles, and there's kind of problem that like. It gets into this whole thing about it's kind of, I have to admit, it's kind of ridiculous to try to be an astrologer or to try to be a diviner, a divinator, and to run this as a business in the usual capitalistic sense that you want to have a good business. You want to get more people wanting to ask more questions all the time. And to be honest, I haven't been doing a lot of like chart readings for people recently. I've been more just focusing on doing this channel, but when I found it was common that people didn't really like, you know, it helps if somebody has some kind of intention that's leading them to look for some kind of information or answers in their chart or from a reading. But so often I'd be doing chart readings for people and people didn't know what questions to ask, right? And, you know, from the point of view of somebody who's training to do divination work and who's eager to put these practices to use and see what kind of answers you get, I think there's some kind of wisdom in just not being sure if you want to ask a question, or not being sure if maybe it's better, like this whole thing about like the perfection of snow, and that you don't want to like track your footprints all around the snow trying to get answers or whatever, right? And then there's this other kind of thing that like, if you're asking questions about your own life, and your own life requires you to take action, to make decisions, to do things, and you're asking questions about your own life and things that you will have to act and make decisions on, you know, like for example, like the whole thing about, you know, let's say even something simple like getting a job or something, right? If you were to ask a fortune teller, "Hey, I'm unemployed, I need work. If I'm looking for work right now, am I going to have success or not? Am I going to get a job?" Right? And they're like, "Well," and then the fortune teller does their thing and says, "No, you're not going to find work," right? So you're going to be like, "Well, if you didn't tell me that, maybe I would go out and with some resumes and I go and apply here and I go and apply there and I would like, you know, run." But if you're telling me that I'm not going to, you know, then what's the point? Maybe I won't do that. Maybe all that energy but then the whole thing is like, you know what I'm saying? Is like, if you're getting an answer saying that you are not going to get the job and your response to that is to not try to apply, then you're definitely not going to get the job, right? But then, you know, this is the whole question, is that if you have some ability to foresee how the future is going to go, how is that coloring your involvement with your responsibility in your life? And that maybe it's better not to ask those questions in the first place. And that if you're running a business, that you don't care if people are asking good questions, you know, you just want people to ask you questions and to pay you money, then, you know, like maybe you're doing people a disservice by giving them the correct answers that they're looking. Maybe you could be a really good divinator, but really mess people up by giving them answers to questions that they rather wouldn't know, right? And I mean, there's this whole big can of worms here too, with like, you know, when it comes to all sorts of things like death and illness and all this kind of stuff, that there's all sorts of things I could look for information or guidance or answers in, but it's like, the more I do this, the more sense that it's just better to know that there are certain questions not to ask, certain things not to investigate, certain things, you just kind of have to let life play itself out and trust that everything's perfect, right? And that you don't need to go trampling your little footprints around and, you know, making a whole bunch of noise for no reason, right? There's another thing though in all of this, which is like, in mind of the current situation that we're in with looming disasters and wars and all this kind of stuff, that in the planet that's in this book, you're talking about a civilization that's much, much older than ours, right? And it's on a planet that the visitor calls winter, right? Because it's a cold planet, it's an old planet. You get the sense of a planet that's very, very steeped in its traditions, in its ways of doing things, and it's not like it's contrasting against this idea of a human civilization where we have this really quick burst of technological progress that seems to just fling us right into catastrophic war and stuff like that, and that. In contrast, this alien civilization, they're describing an alien civilization which doesn't have large-scale wars, but I'm only partway through this book, and they're sort of teasing that, like, maybe this really old alien civilization that just doesn't have war is inching towards. There's certain battles that are starting to flare up where it's like maybe there is going to be a war or something, right? But it's a civilization that doesn't take war as just being an inherent quality of its tradition or of human nature or just the way things go, that if a war was to break out in this civilization, it would be something very, very different. It would be something that would be really a break with how they do things, right? And there's something about this too, which has to do with this. I thought it was fitting to reflect on some of this stuff because as the planet Jupiter in Gemini stations retrograde, basically what happens is we have a slowing down, right? We have the stationing process is the planet isn't literally slowing down, but when we look at the sky and we look at the movement of the planet across the sky, it's an optical illusion that makes it look like the planet is slowing down and then turning around and going in the other direction, right? But in this sort of like slow down phase of a retrograde cycle, there's a certain part of this book where instead of the people on this planet having personal cars, they have these things that are like land boats, which are kind of like trains, or maybe it's kind of similar. Maybe they got the idea for, Star Wars, how the Jawas all pile into this big massive thing that chugs along at a not very, very fast pace through the desert or whatever, right? That there's some kind of like thing about, like, if you can think about, this person describes being a visitor on this planet as just not being used to this and being like, you guys have the technology to build faster vehicles. Why don't you? And they're just like, well, why would we? Right? And it's like there's this kind of like attitude where of just being caught in this culture where it's like it feels like I don't drive, right? And I'm not really interested in driving, although this is something that I've been kind of exploring on this channel, that there's something about like by not driving and by experiencing and by walking around more or experiencing life at a kind of a different pace, I get a different kind of like awareness of life in general. And it just sort of, sometimes it just feels like it's like living in a culture that's very, very impatient, or living in a culture that also has, like, we've lost. I mean, there's this idea of like living for the short term or living for the long term, right? And that in this science fiction novel, we're talking about a long-term civilization that is slow and patient and putting up with this cold environment, and it's like the idea of the Jupiter in Gemini, I think, is also like the idea of multiplicity, right? Of showing that there could be different ways to do things or different perspectives to take. I'm kind of tiptoeing. I haven't gotten into it. There's the biggest thing about this story is about the people, the aliens on this planet are kind of hermaphroditic, right? That basically they spend most of their lives being agender or asexual, but when they enter into their mating period, then a person could turn into a man or a woman, but only in the context of initiating their. And then also in this planet, they don't have as much of a strict system of children belonging to specific parents. There's this kind of idea that like people step outside their ordinary life into this phase of mating, produce children, and then step out of that partner. And the thing is, if you were to, what we take as a, the norms, the traditional norms of human civilization, of married couples that stay together for the rest of their lives, in this civilization, if you keep that up after the mating period, you are actually committing a taboo. And that and so that there's like, it's a kind of this like Ursula K. Le Guin is creating this alien planet of an alien culture to present a kind of an inverse of whatever and for them this is what for them what's completely traditional and what has sustained them for aeons and aeons and aeons, and from their perspective to do things the other way would be like shocking and horrible, right? And so she's trying using this device of a science fiction novel to say that all these things that we, what if it was the complete opposite of this, right? And what if instead of being impatient and rushing around in our cars down the highway at like a million miles an hour, we all piled into a communal land boat and traveled at 25 miles an hour, and everything took a lot longer to do, and everybody was a lot more patient, and this idea that we're always spiraling into some sort of cataclysmic destruction where everybody's about to kill each other. This would seem like a kind of a very alien and foreign idea, right? Like, and you can see how this kind of like comes out of like 1969 hippie people like kind of having a different way of looking at things, and that Jupiter and Gemini is at least playing with this, having a conversation or being able to offer different points of view of things, right? And I think there's something about the kind of Jupiter as a teacher, Jupiter as a kind of a wisdom, and this particular moment that we're in right now, that there's like, I don't know. To me, I was just drawn. It seemed like the right time. I'd never read an Ursula K. Le Guin novel before. I figured I was just motivated to get into it, and then I looked at the astrology and found out that Ursula K. Le Guin has this Mercury, Sun and Mercury and Venus and Libra all trining Jupiter and Gemini, right? And I don't know. There's something else about this that kind of lends itself to something that I would want to talk about on my astrology channel. There's some kind of direct relevance to divination and the spiritual practice of being into stuff like Taoism and meditation and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, in contrast, I was reading this for the better chunk of this year, and I have to admit that this book is kind of like, I've been hesitating to say anything about it, and I have to admit that this guy's also Jupiter and Gemini, right? Ursula K. Le Guin. Let's just to compare things here. Ursula K. Le Guin was born October 21st, 1929. To give a comparison, Philip K. Dick, who is friends with Ursula K. Le Guin, was born December 16th, 1928. So they were only a year apart. They were the same age. Apparently they went to school with each other, and they weren't super close friends, but they used to write each other letters, and they were both science fiction authors who grew up in the same area, who knew each other and stuff like that. To compare with that, apparently Samuel Delany was born April 1st, 1942. Now, April 1st is funny because it's April Fool's Day. So that immediately that makes me wonder, is this really an accurate chart? Is this really true? But it says he's got an A-rated chart. So apparently he was born on April Fool's Day, 1942. So this automatically sets up Delany as a younger generation to Ursula K. Le Guin, Philip K. Dick, younger by approximately 12 years. Or if you look at it in terms of Jupiter cycles, Delany is one whole Jupiter cycle younger. When Ursula K. Le Guin was having her first Jupiter return, Samuel Delany was born, right? And I don't know. There's a lot of stuff about this. This is a book that in some way, after having read a whole bunch of Philip K. Dick books, and this is kind of fitting it into this like 60s, 70s science fiction kind of category. It feels like this guy's a lot better of a writer than Philip K. Dick. I'm going to say that, but then this book has this quality of, I don't want to spoil too much but not a lot happens, and the stuff that does happens, I don't want to do a lot of spoilers with this, right? But I will say, just generally thematically, there's a lot of stuff in it that I don't really feel like talking about because there's a lot of sex in it. There's a decent amount of violence in it. The sex that is in it is a character who's bisexual and who is, Delany is a black guy writing in this book, writing from the perspective of a character who is half native, half white, and who basically gets pulled into a kind of a gang life, right? And this is kind of the kind of thing that it's like not really. I'm reading this from the perspective of being a white guy in 2024 living with my mother and sister in suburbia and really not being immersed in this life at all, right? But there's this sort of like thing about like the if you can imagine, this guy's writing this novel during 1969 through the early years of the 70s, and there's some kind of like basic quality of that reminds me a little bit of when I was living in Australia. There's a certain kind of a quality, like I was living on Vancouver Island for a while, and there's something about like, then there's also apparently there's some references he makes to Australia in this book, but I don't know, there's something about the this quality of not just, there's some kind of quality about like on Vancouver Island and with what you might call hippie culture. I don't know if everybody identifies as a hippie, but there's some kind of, at some point in time, there are these situations that feel like you are immersed in like a pack of like feral adolescents that are just like anarchistic and kind of wild, right? And for me, it was like when I was young, I went to Australia for a whole year, and at least, I feel awkward kind of trying to play that side of it up, but there was more of this sense of just being, rather than being stuck at home in your kind of like middle class suburban life, you are out there mixing up with a collectivity of a kind of like these groups of kids, right? And the kids are kind of like reckless and they're kind of anarchistic and they're kind of like getting in, and there's this sort of just this kind of like, but you're immersed in this kind of collective life, right? And I have to say that part of the attraction to this Delany book was the fact that like, there's something about that which when I was in Nanaimo, there's too much drugs and partying, and it was not really, I don't really felt like, I was kind of mixed into something that I didn't really feel like I belonged with, or that I wasn't really getting immersed in it. But there was something about that, there's still some sort of gravitational pull or attraction to that kind of life, I guess. But there's some kind of like, being really just stuck in a kind of like what feels like a middle class suburban very white kind of lifestyle, and especially in this the politics right now where everybody, there's the main concern of like the conservatives in this election where I am is like, being tough on crime, or being we have to be, we got to keep all these immigrants out. We got to keep all these refugees out, and this being this really kind of like pearl clutching, like kind of like uptight middle class, like white conservative. And then then what's also funny is that there are a lot of like people from other cultures. They seem to just internalize this kind of dynamic where they're like, people, we have to imitate this, because if we don't imitate this sort of like uptight conservative kind of like thing, that people are going to judge us as being some sort of foreign enemy that's like a threat to them or something, right? I don't know. It's like at least I have to admit that there's a certain kind of escapism but there's also, there's something about like actually getting into this, it's like from the subjectivity of being a white guy stuck at my, stuck in the suburbs living with my mom and my sister, that there's a certain dynamic in this book that it's not just about being mixed up in this sort of anarchistic feral gang youth culture. There's also this this sort of like oscillation between that and a kind of a bourgeoisie literate culture, which I admittedly I don't have much exposure to, right? I don't have that, but there's something about there's something about like high culture, the verticality, right? High culture and low culture, right? And being this sort of like from this perspective of, you can tell this guy is writing this as he's in his 20s. Some people have recognized that he has some sort of talent as a writer. He's meeting people who are more established as writers, who are either encouraging him or criticizing him, but he's also mixing between like there's something about like it feels really oftentimes really kind of like Taxi Driver almost, and in this sort of like there's something about it where you don't really want to romanticize, or like it kind of gets under your skin, or like it presses your buttons in ways that like it kind of makes you uncomfortable, and you don't really want. This is why I didn't really, I've been hesitating to say anything about this, but the fact that Delany also has Jupiter in Gemini, and there's this reoccurring Jupiter in Gemini theme. And what I'm highlighting here about the Jupiter in Gemini is that in the Mercury is that there's often this kind of like back and forth of like playing basketball or tennis or court sports or trying to involve multiple perspectives. And there's something interesting about this, particularly where you've got this contrast between getting in the dirt and the grime of this sort of like feral youth culture versus this sort of like high-minded, kind of university-educated, literate, sophisticated kind of, and there's this weird kind of like, this is kind of the sense of the 60s of like boundary dissolving, right? But then there are specific, you read the book and you will see what I'm talking about, but there are very specific points where you have these boundary dissolving psychedelic experiences, but then you hit a kind of, it's like something that is not so easily dissolved. Some sort of friction point that is not so easily going to resolve itself, and the sense that there are like sparks flying out of these things that aren't going to easily just, it's not just going to be peace and love and everybody accepting each other. Like, even in the middle of the 60s, there's some kind of friction there. And I think that, and this is from reading from there's also this sort of like, there's this kind of thing, I have to admit, that a lot of being somebody who's been getting more into literature since COVID, one of the influences on this whole thing has been, there's a sort of politicization around the patriarchy, white male patriarchy, and this kind of idea. There's a certain, on one hand, there's a defensiveness, because there are a lot of people who don't want the whole history of literature just to be thrown out because, they're just a bunch of old white men. They don't have any, these are people who don't care about the indigenous people, who don't care about the blacks and other cultures. They don't care about what women have to say. And the more you read these guys, the more you're just going to be a stuck-up white male patriarch. And for this reason, we need to lend our attention to other voices, to women, to the gay and lesbian community, to people of culture, people of color, right? And so there are, in both of these books, I think it goes with this Jupiter retrograde in Gemini, and there's a certain kind of quality of embracing diversity. But, if you look at the astrology that's going on, Jupiter in Gemini is also squared by Saturn and Neptune in Pisces, and Saturn can be a very kind of like in the Left Hand of Darkness, how they have this winter world that is really old and really just like, we've survived aeons and aeons and aeons by these codes and traditions, and that we're very strict about them, and we really invest a lot in this sort of way of doing things, and that we take outsiders, the outsiders seem, people who do things differently culturally are kind of looked at with, I don't know. I'm not going to get too into that. But there's this kind of quality of like the conservative nature of Saturn versus Jupiter in Gemini as being a kind of an embracing of multicultural diversity, or listening to the minoritarian perspective, right? That if there's the patriarchy creates a white male majority, that we can listen to female authors, we can listen to authors of color, gay and lesbian authors, and that this is basically like, this is the whole thing, is that like I think maybe even Philip K. Dick represents maybe a bit of this patriarchal bias, because Philip K. Dick, for the quality of his writing versus he's not actually that good, but he's a white male guy who's easily adopted into, you know, having movies like Blade Runner, having movies like what's the other ones? I don't have to get into all of them, right? But Total Recall, A Scanner Darkly. There's been tons of movies made out of Philip K. Dick books. I don't think, has there ever been, I mean, there's a Studio Ghibli movie for the Tales of Earthsea that didn't, you know, there's not a lot of like Ursula K. Le Guin adaptations. This is the whole thing, is like, one of the things about, okay, Jupiter and Gemini, and what attracted me to read Dhalgren, there's something about this, is it's like, I had never heard of this book at all, or this author, until just a couple years ago. Or there was something, there's something about this that's like, it's not, for me, it's not just playing into this sort of progressive thing of, you know, listening to other voices and different perspectives, but that it's like the world, for me, there's something encouraging that there's so much more out there than what we know, right? And even if that's just the world of literature, right? That I just find that people get sort of like cramped down in this very narrow, like you have this very narrow range of like references to draw on, where you're like, oh yeah, back when I was in college, I read this book and I watched that movie and I did. And you've got these people that are like that they've become old and crusty, and that all they can draw on for references is just a few limited range of things, and that like, you know, and outside of that, they're like, they have no idea, right? But there's something interesting about this, is that like, it's not, this one particularly is like, from a white male patriarchal straight subjectivity. I don't know, like, if I have, you know, I mean, there's something like, do I have like latent homosexuality, or does everybody have latent homosexuality? I don't know, but this is the kind of like, all these kinds of like pressure points or areas of tension, like this book kind of like pokes them, and you're kind of like, it took me a while to get through this, because I was always like, oh my, do I want to deal with this book right now? Really? Like, you know, it's like, it's a bit much, right? But it's good though, but it's good, but it's like, it's kind of like a heavy load to take on, and it is, you know, this book is just as psychedelic, if not more, than anything Philip K. Dick did with like Valis or Ubik, but it's very own. It's very unique. I don't think I've ever, like, I don't know if there's anything else like this. It's a very singular experience, this particular book. And I mean, I haven't said anything about it, but the basic plot is that there is a town, a city, a fictional city called Bologna, which is immediately kind of funny, because I am from British Columbia, and there's a city in British Columbia called Kelowna, and it sort of makes it like, there's some connection between Kelowna and Bologna? I don't know, but there's something about the idea of the zone motif, where in Stalker or Roadside Picnic, there's some area that the government has sectioned off, that has been evacuated, that the stalker is a guy who takes people into the zone, bypasses the authorities, and takes them into this strange place, right? The similar motif was in this book or movie called Annihilation. And then in Dhalgren, there is a city that has been more or less abandoned, that there are still people living there, but mostly the city is deserted, and the people that, and it's kind of funny because there's this weird mix, the people that live there is a weird mix of these kinds of feral gangs of youths and adolescents, and for some reason little spatterings of kind of like middle class people that are still just carrying on, and there's something about, like, again, there's certain things that about the life that I've been living, the circumstances of being alive as a Canadian in 2024, and it's like there's a sense of housing scarcity, which isn't really, is like is a false housing crisis, because we do actually have housing, but there's a tendency to build all these luxury flats, luxury apartments, luxury condos that nobody can afford. And that there's this idea that the property developers have this idea in mind that there are going to be wealthy Chinese billionaire investors, and that if you're going to make your money back on a housing project, it's better to build really expensive luxury condos and then hope the super wealthy elite are going to like pay out their ass for them so you can make your money back, rather than making housing that the average ordinary person could realistically afford. And as such, the wealthy elite people who are supposed to be able to afford all these luxury condos just aren't around, right? And if you pay attention to news in China, there's things like malls which have been built to provide things like, the luxury consumer goods like jewelry and expensive designer purses and fashion. And the people aren't buying that in China. The luxury elite Chinese wealthy class is supposed to buy all this real estate. They're hitting a recession. They're not going to buy these luxury condos. Right? There's a bit of discretion, but it's also not just Vancouver, but Vancouver is apparently the third most unreasonable city for cost of living, for affordability, second only to Sydney, Australia, and Hong Kong, right? So it's like we're in this situation. It's interesting to read this book because we're describing a situation where there's been some kind of natural disaster or something. There's a certain ambiguity inherent to the book which makes it kind of interesting, because they never, by the end of the book, maybe you can put it together, but I'm not going to spoil it for you, right? There's this attitude of that. Imagine a very different scenario where you were a city that there were people, but not very many of them, and you just had houses and houses and houses that had just been abandoned. And the people that live there are very kind of crazy and reckless. You might have a bunch of people living in your house, and all of a sudden your house goes up in flames, but it doesn't matter because you could just go and just kind of find some other random abandoned house to squat in. And it's like, if you don't like this house, there are plenty of. The only risk though is that like maybe as you're exploring these houses, maybe somebody else has already got the house and they're camped out there with a shotgun, and you don't know if you're going to get shot at. So there's certain risk of danger, but housing is free. It's available. There's all sorts of housing. And then the thing is, there's also this thing is like in this post-COVID era, there's a certain underlying thing that we're going to be facing food scarcity or a lack of supplies and resources. And what this has translated, like in my experience, it's been like there's been a sriracha shortage. There's a certain trendy kind of hot sauce that was made popular by the earlier hipster generations, that everybody liked the hot sauce with the rooster on it, and now it's hard to find this one kind of hot, but like, I mean, other than that, food is generally like more expensive than it used to be, but nobody's going hungry here, right? Nobody has a shortage of food, right? And there's this kind of funny though that even in this, like I'm living with my mother and my sister, and my mother is somebody who's of this generation that grew up during the 60s and 70s, who would have lived through this period of time that these books were read, and there was an economic depression in the 70s. And like the thing is, like we got a CSA box, right? We get food from local farmers, right? I'm lucky to live in a place where we have all sorts of like local agriculture, that we don't have to import things from far away. And I'm just saying, this is a kind of quirk of my family, that my mother still likes eating Spam, right? Like, or eating this kind of macaroni and cheese, right? Like Kraft Dinner. Like the kinds of things that if you were in a bomb shelter and you had no access to like fresh vegetables or you could just like stockpile a whole you could just have crates and crates and crates of like mac and cheese and Spam or like canned this and that. And like, I don't know what the like, it's like, does it make you feel like you're being frugal to like eat like I mean, Spam is like a joke, right? Like Spam, like Monty Python made a joke out of Spam. Like it's this like gross stuff that like nobody really wants. That's just like, it's like filler, right? And it, like that's become to use in the internet world. Spam has been used as this, the early internet slang to describe junk emails you don't want. And yet my mother willingly goes out to buy Spam. And it's like, why don't you eat something good for you? You know, it's like, but I mean, I don't know. I don't want to just judge my mom for eating, but there's something about like dealing with somebody who's of this generation, right? Who is like, my mom was born in the 50s, so she is like 10 years younger than Delany. But she's like being like, I don't know if it's the conditioning of growing up in that era that you just have it like imprinted in your mind that you have to like eat like he talks about it as this really depressing thing where you've got like you're just cutting off the, you know, you've got this moldy loaf of bread and you're just cutting off the moldy bits and patching together this really sad, like this stale ass bread with some like Spam sandwich, and you're just miserably, and like my mom will just do that, you know. I mean, she's got fresh bread, but she still just is like, she's like, oh, you know, we have to live frugally, so I guess I'll just eat these shitty Spam sandwiches, right? And it's just like, it's just, I don't know. I'm just trying to describe the situation. Like, we don't have to live like this. We're actually really well off in terms of having food and having access to all the things that can live healthily. And in this novel, you've got people who are eating Spam because they don't have access to that. The only way that you can eat is by going into these abandoned grocery stores and just rummaging through whatever hasn't been looted yet, right? And that, you know, similarly, there's this whole thing where there aren't a lot of vehicles in this in this novel. That you have people going out on foot a lot, right? And they're saying that like there's this one line in that like, you know, people that aren't able to walk further than the end of their driveways don't last very long in this kind of situation, right? There's more. In this book, there's more scenes of people getting, for some reason, it's kind of funny because it's like everybody is taken off, but for some reason there's still some bus driver who's driving a bus, right? And so like there are some basic like civil services such as like public transit that are somehow still operational, even though this is like a zone where everybody is deserted and people are just looting these abandoned stores. There's still like a bus driver, and it's like there's this kind of like, it's just a really, for me it's like just, it offers this kind of like way to, maybe it's a bit of escapism, but I just feel like the mentality of where I live is that like everybody is like stressed out about the cost of living, stressed out about scarcity, even though they have access to all sorts of good food. But it's like you got people driving these like Denalis, these Toyota Tundras, or like Toyota Tacomas, these expensive pickup, like to be a man, you've got to have an expensive pickup truck, right? You're not even like a real person unless you drive, right? And it's like you've got all these people that are like, we're like barreling into this crazy war into the Middle East, you know, and it's like, there's a sort of like, if you go out in public, I just get the sense of like a bunch of really stressed out people who are like encapsulated in these massive like, you know, McLuhan talked about it like they were like beetle carapaces, right? Like you're encapsulated in this shell that like keeps you separate from the rest of the world, and you're just like, you know, all these people just like barreling around at, you know, there's something about the, you know, Kim Gordon just released a song the other day called Bangin' on the Highway, right? And this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking, like, I don't drive, and it's like, what's my motivation for getting a car right now anyways? Like, all this pressure to get a vehicle so I can be anxiously just speeding down the highway to where? To do what exactly? Right? like we're like, but you can't stay here. Like, I mean, well, in Florida, it makes sense that people are that you have this big storm in Florida and everybody has to evacuate. But there's this kind of sense that like there's this kind of sense that you're like, I don't know. There's this weird kind of like we're thinking about what the future might be like. And being like, oh, everybody's got to get a car, and like, you know, you got to be ready to pile all your cans of Spam in the back of your car, and like, you know, take off to the hills because it's all good. Like, civilization's good. This is kind of like Dhalgren is like you know, there's this sense of like that's already happened, and all the people that were going to do that have taken off, and now you just have all these empty houses and a bunch of kids who don't drive, or a bunch of feral teenagers just walking around. And being like, you know, there is the problem. There's some sort of. I watched also that movie Civil War recently, and there's some kind of like bits of it. There's this part where the guy, you know, there's I don't know. I don't want to give away too much of what goes on in this book, but there's certain scenes of Civil War which feel like it hits a chord with Dhalgren in a certain way. But yeah, I'm going to spoil it, right? But there's some kind of like this is what it feels like right now. And I'm kind of like, yeah, and there's this question of like, you know, do you really want to, like, what's healthy in this context? What's sane in this context? What's normal in this context? I don't know, man. I'm just putting it out there. This is an hour-long video, and, you know, maybe a little bit different from what the other astrology channels are doing, but maybe you can catch my drift. Why I'm going in this direction and not another direction, right? All right, thanks for watching.